5.
Hi, welcome to AP Human Geography. So glad you could join us on this Monday. Last week of reviews, here we go. I'm going to transfer over to my screen so that we can see, make sure we're all in the right place. Let a few other people log in these last few minutes. For those of you that are new to this, my name is Kristen Brandt. I'm from Glenbard West High School in Glen Ellen, Illinois. We are going to be using the Ask Questions Live. We're going to do that with Slido.com. They will be moderated. We have a ton to cover today. In fact, I feel the need for speed. That's right, that if you haven't, that's Top Gun, because we do have so much we need to cover with today's topic. So we're going to be a little bit picky with some of the questions that we pull over. As always, if you have questions that you feel like they're just not answered, please reach out to your teacher. Your teachers would love to engage in conversations with you with these content questions. So on Friday, I left you with this FRQ. And we were talking about, using qualitative data to answer some of these questions. And so these photographs depict rural and urban landscapes within Quebec, Canada. So the first thing that you should think about when you see, you should at least try to put it, that location, because it's always about the why of the where. And you should think in your head, okay, I'm gonna look at these images, but what else do I know about Canada or Quebec? And you should know that we talk about a bilingual country, in particular French settlement along that area. Why is that important? Well, let's take a look. When we look at A, identify one agricultural or technological feature of the rural landscape shown in the photograph. Do you see these long lines here kind of stretching out from the river? So I would say I might talk about long lots. That's a very European system. We're trying to keep all the soil the same, and so that European influence on Quebec farmland. You could talk about technological, and you would talk about maybe if you did that, you would talk about the silos or the grain bins, that idea of storing our crops before sale. You could also talk about some of the roads and transportation. That would also work. Letter B, identify one architectural or technological feature of the urban landscape shown in the photograph. So now you're going to flip over to the right. So here, if you're talking architecture, you might want to talk about definitely that you can see the European influence in the buildings. And so that would be part of that landscape. If I was talking about technological feature, my mind immediately jumped to this clearly looks like a break of bulk point or some sort of tourist hub, because I can see the boats coming in. Looks like maybe a cruise ship, but back here it looks like I've got some sort of port where I'm bringing goods to that area and transferring those goods. So describe one way that the country's physical landscape may influence its cultural landscape. So that's really what I was talking about here, is that it's based off of it. So first I just identified, now I'm going to describe it. So if I identified those long lots, maybe I would talk about how they were really, and if you used, instead of long lots, if you used meets and bounds, that would probably work as well too. But how they use the river as kind of that starting point and moving out from the river to ensure access to that resource or available land. You could talk about, if I was looking at the urban, that physical landscape, I would totally talk about how the town set up along the river. Clearly it looks like for trade, for tourism, but that river is the way of moving goods and people in and out. Explain how the cultural landscape shown in one or both conveys a local sense of place. And so this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I was choosing these images based off of, there's one about the Netherlands so I was kind of mimicking this. I would talk here though, instead of globalization, but that local sense of place is kind of that, how does this reflect the French culture or the European culture? I would say, or I think if you really drill down, it looks like, is there some sort of entertainment district here in the urban photograph? And so talking about how you're seeing in this urban photograph, that idea of kind of a hub. We talk about kind of that central place of bringing people together. It looks like that's what they've done there. If I was looking at the agricultural one, that local sense of place, this looks like a pretty large farm. And so is this kind of a place where all the resources then are pooled together? You don't always have to be right. What you have to be is be able to explain it. And so sometimes if your interpretation might be, you're like, maybe this isn't a little touristy area down here, but you're really connecting to how that defines the people and how that could define the people, you're gonna get some points. And so the idea with College Board members, they want to give you points. You know, sometimes I tell my own students that I'm harder on them because I look for opportunities to take away points. And I think that they're really trying to see, what do you know? Are you able to apply that knowledge? Okay. Anything? So some of the cons of long lots, I think some of the cons when you start talking long lots, even though that's not the question here because there's no compare, but one of the cons just could be is just when we talk about elongated states as well, the further you get away from the center point or where your farm is, sometimes that makes it more difficult. But the other thing is long lots also, sometimes everybody's going to have some part of probably crappy land as well. Not all the land's going to be great. Okay. So 2 weeks from tomorrow, right? We're going to take our AP exam on May 12th. That week of May 4th, we are going to practice. So next Monday, we're going to actually, I'm going to proctor an exam for you. We're going to do the time, and I'm going to sit here with my mouth shut, but we're going to practice the timing. We're going to actually practice a whole one. So I know there's a lot of questions here. Don't feel that you need to keep, we're going to practice it, but I still cannot recommend enough. Get into AP Classroom, and there's plenty of practice ones there for you to continue to practice with as well. Because the idea is we want to keep developing those skills of explaining and describing and comparing. So again, it looks like stuff is coming through. I appreciate for those of you that are talk to me goose. Just want to keep the Top Gun stuff going, I guess, today. But that idea of asking those questions, helping one another out. Okay, today, the reason I said today that I feel the need for speed, we're going to talk about scale. And there's so much we need to talk about when we go to scale. It comes up in so many different different units, but I would say, you know, my teachers are constantly talking about that zooming in, zooming out. How does that impact the story that we're trying to tell? And that's what we're going to look at. Because when we talk about it, we want to be able to identify those scales, but then we also need to be able to explain them, compare. Remember, we're going to talk about the similarities and differences, strengths and weaknesses, and then also that degree to which that concept is seen across various scales. And so I'm going to use sometimes some different scales to tell some stories. The biggest thing, remember, so, and Miss Lindsay's told you this, I know 100 times. Again, we're not going to have you identify something that you can look up online. I can't guarantee that this could be one of the task verbs, but you saw how we were just identifying from images. That could happen. So I'm going to show you how we might use that when we talk about scales as well. But we're going to focus again on explain. So this is that detailed account. And so what I really need you listening to is not necessarily memorizing all the events. It's how am I telling the story? How am I connecting the scales? And that's part of this comparing as well, some of those similarities and differences. So I'm going to try some different stuff. So we'll go from there. So these are all the different units that we are going to cover today. I'm just going to pause. You don't have to approve everything. Okay, so I was just kind of reminding my son as he's pushing some of the questions through. So these are all the different things. That's a ton of different chapters that we have to go through, and I think you're going to see a ton of value in what we're looking at. So here we go. So what we're going to focus here on Unit 1 is that idea of identify. Okay, so I'm going to just show you from Unit 1, Scales of Analysis, how we could do that. So the first thing here, you see I've got a map of the share of population living in extreme poverty. So we could ask scale. You're going to say global. And then you might look for some trends, and definitely you're going to see where we see some extreme poverty, definitely in sub-Saharan Africa, India. But again, the identifying the scale is going to definitely be global. Then I could look at it from a national. That would be looking from a national scale. So now I'm going to look at the United States. So if I look at the global scale, you're going to say the US doesn't look like anybody lives in poverty. However, if I look at the national scale, take a look at this. Now I'm looking at some areas where we do see some states that struggle with poverty. And then I could even pull up a county map. Okay, so I was continuing to narrow that scale, and you can see we could even pinpoint those counties within it. And the reality is you could look within your town, or in this case, we looked at our school district just to look at the percentage of students here of our low income students. We can continue to drill down. So all that idea of identify, notice we just took a story and we missed some things sometimes. depending on the scale. So it's what story is it we're trying to tell? The first step is identifying what scale it's at. In Unit 3, we talk about contemporary causes of diffusion. So this is explaining now. So now we're going to look at some scales and we're going to talk about how do we explain. So we're going to talk really about the relationship here and how we might tell a story. So for example, we're not identifying, but you can see this is at the global. Okay, and so we look for a trend and we're explaining what trends do we see here. So percentage of people living in urban areas, and we definitely should see that the MDCs are much more urbanized than our LDCs or nations in transition. Okay, well now I pulled up this map and it says the share of population using the internet in 2015. Also at the global scale, but I've changed the content. So now it's the relationship. What's the relationship between people living in urban areas and using the internet? What trends do you see? Do you see where we start to see less people with internet access in some of those rural areas? Still gets a little difficult. So what we could do is we could actually drill down to that national level, and I would say even the state level. So within India here. And so we see where we've got some highly urbanized areas. And then is there a connection between Facebook users as a percentage of the state's population? Take a look. Do we see, is there a connection between living in urban areas and having access to internet, to using Facebook, to that exposure? And so that's how we're using scale then to start to tell a story. What's the relationship? Why might that be? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I go to travel to my mom and dad's in rural Wisconsin, and this is the United States, I have better connectivity here in the Chicagoland area than I do in that rural area. Sometimes my children will tell that's just because of the carrier that we have, which is true. But the speed at which things come, sometimes there's better access the closer you are to urban areas. So we're going to continue along that path of looking at spatial relationships across various scales. And so this time we're going to look at political power. And this is something we haven't really talked about. So I wanted to just take a minute to talk a little bit about choke points. So I'm not sure if your teachers have talked about choke points. It's not necessarily on the on tests. I actually have not talked about it much with my students. But here's what's interesting. When we're talking about scale and trade, right? A choke point is actually really important. And so what a choke point is, it's a narrow body of water where we're moving goods through. So a lot of times think canals, like the Suez Canal, Panama Canal. If I cut that off, I can cut off trade. The Strait of Hormuz, if I look right here, this is one during the Kuwait War, the Persian Gulf Wars, that the US had put some ships in there to cut off and stop some of that trade. So it was difficult to get goods out. And so again, we're going to talk about some relationships. So I just wanted to make sure that you kind of had a little idea on what choke points were. But they tell you, I mean, these are shipping routes. You can see some of these major routes as we're moving goods. But the whole idea of a choke point is if I cut it off, I can cut off that trade route. So that's what that map is looking at. Well, then I could say, well, let's maybe narrow it down. Let's not look at everything. Let's look at just oil. And then let's look at really kind of highlight that oil movement and really highlight some of the bigger areas. That still doesn't really, we're talking scale. Okay, what if we just looked at the Asian routes, okay, versus non-Asian routes? And so we're moving them through these maritime choke points. And then we really get even more narrow in scale and we talk about, let's compare and contrast the Suez to the Panama Canal. And so that whole idea of what you would be doing right now is you would say, okay, it looks like we've got a lot of movement happening on the global scale, but when we start breaking it down to some of these smaller scales, then we start to see, okay, where are really these areas of importance? Start talking about the geography, what's around there? Why? Look at the Suez Canal. We've got the percentage of their share of that seaborne travel is so much greater than Panama. Okay, well, what's around there? What is it connected to? Think about its location between Southwest Asia / Middle East and Europe versus we've got taking a look at Central America connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And so that's the type of conversation you would want to start having. Why would the oceans not be considered choke points? So the whole ocean itself, we couldn't cut off the whole ocean itself. So think a strait, remember that narrow body of land, the whole idea is that I can cut it off. And so I put my ship there, I can stop it. The reality is I can't cut off all of the Pacific Ocean, okay? So would a checkpoint be placed depending on how developed that country is? It has more to do with the characteristics. I guess, first of all, it has to do with kind of that idea of what benefit does it have? So let's be honest, if I'm looking at the Panama Canal, I don't have to go all the way around South America. The same thing here with the Suez Canal. If I'm trying to get oil from the Arabian Peninsula to the United States, if I don't want to go all the way around Africa, this is going to help shorten that. Now, it makes it sometimes more dangerous moving it through a choke point, but it's all about how do we expedite that trade so that we can cut down on some costs. But the whole connection here that we tried to just do is take you through different scales on how to tell that story. We could even add in a layer here of trade, right? So we were just talking oil, but what if we start talking about other trade and how we can kind of impact other people, not just on, not just through kind of our travel pathways, but what about through tariffs? What about, I mean, take a look at this. We know that, you know, the standoff that they're talking about here in 2018, you know, that these are the things that we import or export. And so there's all these different types of goods as well that maybe we're not going to cut you off by trade, but we could through tariffs. And so those taxes, so it just adds another layer to that story when you're trying to explain to help enhance that movement of goods. We could also dig into, this is Latin America, and this I thought was interesting when we started looking at it. This diagram here, like how deep is that European influence in Latin America? So now what you should start thinking about, this is adding in not just trade, but also some cultural components. I would highly recommend, if you're, those of you that joined late or you missed when I was going over that FRQ, the first thing I did in my head, I said, okay, where's Quebec, Canada? What do I know about that? The same thing when we're talking about these regions, what do you know about the Caribbean? What do you know about Latin America? Like you can see this image over here, they talk about Roman Catholicism in Latin America. Why? Why so much? Okay, where is Spanish spoken versus Portuguese? Because what you're trying to do is build a story so you can enrich your explanations. And so it would logically make sense just based off of this, who's their largest trading partner, right? They should be trading with Europe based off of colonial experience. And so that's part of telling those stories. So this I thought was interesting though. Again, it's part of scale that we start talking about that story. Look at this. We talk a lot about how in Latin America, there's so many countries that are moving forward, those nations in transitions. And yet at the same time, when you get over here, look how far they lag behind South Asia. Okay, in your head, what should you be saying? South Asia, what countries? You should be saying India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, awesome. But then I come over here, they even lag behind Sub-Saharan Africa. So what's going on? What's that investment? Where's the European influence continue to go? And so those just should be some questions that start to really develop as you're looking through it. You don't have to have answers to everything. You have to be able to formulate those questions and then hypothesize some ideas. Could there possibly be choke points like the Great Wall of China and the Mongolians? So there could be some choke points on land as well, especially if we talked about isthmus. And so it's a narrow piece of land that connects two larger pieces of land. Could there be some man-made choke points? Absolutely. We might not use the term choke points. What we will talk about are intervening obstacles that are going to kind of stop that movement of goods and trade. Which is not a horrible segue to political boundaries, because that's kind of what you guys were getting to even with that question about the Great Wall of China. I mean, as we're looking at some of those boundaries, and so that to the degree then that it influences. So what we were just doing is explaining what were some of those connections, and we're going to explain again, but now what we want is how does that actually impact? What's that actual degree? And so I keep coming back. This is one that, so just refreshing your memory when we talk about the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, and we talk about the exclusive economic zone. So remember, this is the area where that continent has exclusive rights of moving their goods in and out of that area. Okay, but everybody sees it a little bit differently. And so, for example, I think this is kind of a cool global map in the top left. And you see the pink areas are ones that are contested. You can see that these are areas that we claim. This one I thought was kind of interesting. If you take a look at French's exclusive economic zones. And so just giving you a framework. Right now, all we're doing is just talking framework and giving the brain kind of wrap around what areas we're talking about. And so you're going to see areas too that they originally colonized. It shouldn't, Suriname over here, French Guiana, that they're going to have some of these areas that they're going to have those exclusive rights. But we know, we've talked about South China Sea, that there's contested areas. So here's what China claims, here's what the UN says, and they don't match. And that's causing some conflict, right? And that's where it's really important. So so now we have the supranational organization, so that's your scale, right? That says this is what it's supposed to be. And then it conflicts with what the national scale, what China says it's going to be. That's where the conflict really starts to develop. And we've seen that. We've got countries involved in territorial conflict across the world where people are disputing things, some more serious than others. And so I was going to highlight just a few. Okay, so a couple that I was going to highlight, because we've talked about Kashmir, but I would highly recommend pick one of these, or pick one, if I go back to here, and just spend some time having one example in your back pocket of some contested area or something where there's some sort of conflict in the world, because a lot of times you can apply it to other scenarios. And so here we've talked about Kashmir before, so I thought I would just pick out a couple different ones that we haven't talked about. So for example, here, the Durand line here between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's a colonial holdover from the British, helped to set that up. But here's what's interesting, that it is recognized on an international level. However, Afghanistan is actually not recognizing it because they feel that that line actually cuts through an ethnic Pushtun population and cuts it in half. And so they are not, so even though internationally we accept this, they are not at their level. Another one, if we take a look, where's number 6? Right here, the Bhutanese enclaves, I would say are actually kind of similar down here with 7 when we talk about, there's some Bangladesh and Indian enclaves in this area too. And so we see these enclaves, and so like India enclaves in Bangladesh, they're saying they do not recognize this border because, or it's contested is a better way of putting it, because they're going to say on our scale, we need to unite our people and bring them back. And the same thing up here is that this idea that China feels that they should be able to take control of this area. And so there's contention over that. We saw this earlier when we were looking at other units when we talked about Crimea and that idea of Russia uniting the Russian-speaking population. So all I'm doing is I'm giving you a variety of examples. You don't need to memorize each single one of them. What you need to be able to do is to have one example that you would be able to explain. Okay, so internal boundaries. So when we start talking about internal boundaries, this one is that identifying the scales, okay? And so when we talk about scales of analysis, so I'm going to do a little bit of talking about identifying, but really more why. Why is that important for us? And so some of these images I've used before. In fact, I've used these two. So when we talk about identify, we would say that this is definitely at a state scale. Okay, so when I look at this, looking at these voting districts, you see a lot of red, right? Absolutely. So this is the 2016 election. This is when Trump received enough electoral votes to become president of the United States. So when I look at this map, if I look at the county scale, you do see, I mean, look at the blue right along the Mississippi River here. There's no blue represented here. Take a look at the blue along Texas over here, and I'm aware, sorry. Or if I take a look at the blue in Florida. So all of a sudden then that is no longer represented at that national scale. So we're identifying, but we're also working towards the story, because I am going to tell you just a little bit here. The other thing too, I mean, I'll use Illinois. We see blue up around where Chicago's located, but if I look at the rest of the state, very little blue. And so kind of, is this a fair representation of that population? Well, where do the bulk of the people live? And so this is where that argument comes in. It's where scale becomes important. Okay, so I do want you to kind of have this in your mind. This is 2016. So now take a look at 2012. This is when Obama won. Okay, and we see a lot of the same things, but we see more. So if I look here, there's a little more blue, right? I'll go back. So we throw in Iowa, we throw in Wisconsin, you throw in Ohio, but for the most, and you throw in Florida. So for the most part, we see a little more blue. But then when we start looking at the counties, really, there's a lot of the same patterns, right? A lot depends on how many people come out to vote, but look at this difference here. Look at here, the blue that clustered along that Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois, the border areas there. And so that was enough to flip some of those states. This map I thought was super cool. So if we look at statewide, countywide, but then we look at just taking a look at popular percentage of votes. And so popular versus electoral, all those are different scales. And so being able to just identify, but notice how the story starts to change. Why is that important? Remember redistricting. That's why this is important. So how we redistrict, remember redistrict every 10 years, we do a census. Okay, we conduct our census, and then we need to redraw these maps to try and best reflect the population that's there, the amount of people. Do we know gerrymandering sometimes takes place? Historically, the answer is yes. Remember where they try to purposely favor one party over another. So take a look at this. This I thought was interesting. When we look at different outcomes, so this is taking a look here of how we could redraw, and they have at different times to benefit one political party over another. And so when we talk about electoral votes here, this gave them 8 Republican regions versus 5, but then if they redraw, so take a look at what 1 starts to look at versus how 2 gets a little bit wonky. Okay, now we can see 5 Democrats to 8, so still kind of the same, but now look at, we can even totally minimize the Democrats here if we cut a little more into 1 and balance it off. And then you look at 2008 though, how it used to be much more Democrat. And so how do they redraw to kind of purposely favor those one groups or another? That's all about scale, right? So all we're doing right now is identifying. So the world map, so this was a good question. What's the difference between a world map at the global scale and a world map at the national scale? So I would say when you're talking, these are going to be more of your national scale. So we're just looking, when you're looking at a specific country, and then I don't have a world map one right at this time, but anytime you see the global scale. And so what is the story you're trying to tell? And so if you see a full map, assume global, and so you're looking for global trends. As I start to narrow down, and if I'm looking at a specific country, now we're starting to look at a national scale, and then even more to the state or the county. These can prevent some challenges, okay, anytime we look at some of these scales as well. And this is where some similarities and differences are going to come into play. And so when we might use one of these scales or one of these relationships over another. So for example, looking at our US, Mexico, Canada, so formerly known as NAFTA. And so when we look at this as far as how might I use it? Okay, and so clearly it looks like Mexico's kind of getting the short end of the stick when we talk about direct investment. But we say, okay, this is when we want to just trade within this region. Where else how can I kind of use it to my advantage? And what we see is that the US has trade disputes. So even though this is our, we've got this supranational organization, these trading partners are well established. You can see that even within Canada, though, that if I look at this third line here, that they've brought some disputes to the World Trade Organization about us, and we've brought some to them. But I thought we had a relationship established. And so then if it's not working, this is where scale comes in. If it's not working where we can't talk to each other, we go even bigger, because the World Trade Organization then, remember, is kind of that bigger supranational organization that's supposed to be overseeing all of that. So then that was interesting. I always think about this. We talk about in my class, and we talk about NATO, the North America Treaty Alliance organization. And so that idea of what countries are a part of this. And so remember, this started out as kind of that World War II response to the Warsaw Pact. You don't need to know that. It's just contextualizing. But it was really kind of originally looking at your communist countries versus your capitalist countries, and really trying to kind of develop an alliance that way. Well, it's kind of evolved into a little bit more, as you can see that there's been expansion over time where we've let other countries into this. But what I find interesting, it's when does the United States choose to go in as NATO, and when does the United States choose to go in as the UN? The problem is that the UN, which is that bigger organization, has these 5 powers. You know, you're permanent, they have the veto rights. And so if one of them says, no, we can't go in to help this country, we can't help them, but enough of these people say that we can go in under NATO. And so the point is knowing when to use which organization. When do you use G8, your smaller group, versus the G20? Again, you don't need to memorize all of this, but this is just taking a look at, when I look at here, it's kind of the which organization is really helping with food security or debt relief or arms or the World Bank. And you can see G8 is doing quite a bit. Sometimes it's easier with a smaller group than a larger group. And so that whole idea of it's knowing what's the situation, and that's about the scale of understanding, okay, the UN isn't going to go in to stop this conflict because someone up here is going to veto it. So then maybe NATO will go in and they're going to be able to bring some forces in to support and to help. Or maybe food security or direct relief. We've got a region of the world that's struggling. Somebody on the Permanent Council has some issues that they're not going to go in, so we're going to go in with a different organization. Again, this is why we look at scale, and we look at that idea of comparing the strengths and the weaknesses of when does it make the most sense to use those organizations. So this is a perfect time then to kind of transition into what are some of those some of the consequences. And so we're going to continue to compare these characteristics, but remember, centrifugal are things that are going to pull a country apart. Centripetal are going to pull a country together. So I think this is a great question, the question that had come up. So here's a good example of this would be global, right? I'm looking at this map. And here's what I see. I see trends. So I'm looking at global trends. I could talk, if I was looking at global trends, I could see that when I look at most MDCs, that they are pretty sustainable or stable compared, you know, according to this is the Fund for Peace. But when I look at sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southwest Asia, that I see that they're definitely very fragile. Okay, well, what does that mean? You know, that they're struggling. So they talk about, you know, indicators such as, you know, economic development, services, intervention, that these are areas, I mean, when you talk about Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, that are in conflict, right? So let's then dig into a national. Let's dig a little bit more into depth. So this is your global, kind of looking at trends. We see definitely, you know, MDCs versus LDCs. And then if I dig in, let's look at Sudan, right? So I'm just looking at a map. You might say, what is it I remember? But here we know that this is a newer state. So why is there still conflict? How did that state come to be? So in your head, you could also be thinking about what are things that unite a country, okay? Religion can unite when we're in line, but religion can also divide us, right? And so that's part what happened here. And so we take a look at kind of animism and Christianity tend to be more focused in that South Sudan area, and we see more Islam in the northern area. Okay, remember this is not drawn to scale. And what I mean by that, I should say, is that we don't see all the little intricacies. It doesn't mean that there's not any Christians up in this area or animism, but that's going to create some conflict, right? And so we know that they're fundamental beliefs, and you could develop that on why they might disagree. Other thing though, but what do we see really? Look along this border. Notice the oil, the refineries. So when we're taking a look at resources, is that also going to create some conflict? Could that also say who owns that? Who's in charge of it? Take a look at that pipeline, working it up to the Red Sea. Why do we need to get it to the Red Sea? Well, that's a trade route, right? Let's bring it back to where I started earlier in the day, talking about choke points and moving it through the Suez Canal. So that idea of understanding, so now we just took this map. Okay, where is it? We layered in a potential centripetal force for the south or the north, but it could be centrifugal if you're not, think about this little region right here, okay, the Islam that's in the south, and then we layer in the resources. We could layer in even more resources. We're not going to, it's not just oil, but there's also other natural resources. And really, what has this created? This has created huge population movement, okay, since 2013. And so moving people out of South Sudan into these other countries. And so then the spillover and the impact that that has had over who controls this land, what my voice, how that voice is being heard, and then the spillover into these other areas as well. So it's not just there. We could, again, let's look at a global. We know that there's also conflict, that representation. So this is taking a look at state parties to the Stateless Nations Convention. So we've got people, places that are struggling or feeling they're not necessarily represented. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here, and we're going to take a look at Spain. So I'm assuming your teachers have gone over maybe one or two of these areas. That we're going to look at Catalonia here a little bit more in depth. Catalonia. So we can see that we've got a couple different states, if you will, within Spain that are highlighted. Well, part of why Catalonia is highlighted, take a look at its percent of Spain's GPD and its population. So what we see, it's got quite a few people living there, and part of that is because it is extremely wealthy. It is very industrialized. They've got a lot of jobs. They have their own language, their own identity. And what we see is that they really are kind of pushing for some independence. And so what we take a look at is that that idea, that they're starting to stake claims even beyond their borders. And so that's starting to create some conflict. And so what we've done is we've taken the same map and we've applied layers of information. And so you don't have to memorize all the ins and outs, but how can you take what you're seeing here and extract what it means? Can't you imagine if you saw somebody taking part of this land of Spain, that's going to cause Spain to be upset? Then what you might say is, well, one way to kind of appease them is maybe this idea of devolution, where we're then giving some, we're going to give more voting rights, we'll give you more voice in return for us to kind of hold on to those borders that already existed. We know that in 2017, there was a vote for independence in Catalonia, and Spain, that it did not, Spain says no, the vote was not enough to create its independent state. But you can see even in a developed country such as Spain, that sometimes there's some conflict as well. Okay, Van Thunen model. You're going to hear a lot of this on Wednesday. We're going to go through some more models and stuff as well. And we'll go through it again, but this is that relationship. And so I wanted to do something a little bit different too, and use some qualitative data too, just to kind of help tell a story. And so we'll get there. We're going to first start with, we take a look at the US and we look at milk cows. And so we start to look for trends. And so we see that they're definitely clustered in this Northeast and in California. So in your head, you should be going, what the heck does this have to do with Van Thunen? Hopefully you're thinking about the milk shed. We talk about heavy populated areas, and we talk about, so at this scale, this seems really important, but then you start looking, okay, Wisconsin, Michigan, they've got some, what else is going on here, especially because we know the population is so heavily concentrated in California, Florida, and New England area. Well, we know that there's been some changes, right? And so then we start talking about pasteurization, our transportation. Remember, Van Thunen's all about access to the market. And so we could say, now we're talking about time as well, right? So you're not just talking about that location, but now past versus present, and how sometimes some of these things are outdated. This one I thought was interesting, also taking a look at market gardening and taking a look at kind of the fresh fruits and vegetables. We say go in that first ring because of their perishability, right? And so getting it to the market, I love this image here, that this truck, and here we've got the city right there. But we also take a look at, in LDCs, different ways that they transport goods. And so sometimes it might be for mass distribution. This one is actually taking it to a larger warehouse, and notice how green those bananas are before they get to the consumer. But sometimes it's just to, I don't know, a local market. And so even in the United States, sometimes it's not about just getting it to the end product where a grocery store, that sometimes it's about getting it to the local consumer. So it's understanding who the consumer is, where it's coming from, and how we might use that. The next two maps that I wanted to put up really up just because I still think it's important for you to look at some trends of other things when we talk about that outer ring in particular. And so here, the cattle and the calves. So that idea of having space, that idea of that last ring of the von Thunen model, that really, I mean, if you think about this area through here, you know, we definitely need that space to spread them out. You might wonder, why do we see so many chickens in the southeast? You know, part's going to be market, part's going to be climate, part's going to be I think access to market. And so really it's understanding just even sometimes where those trends are, so that if you're asked a different question, you could build upon that. And that's really because I believe this is the last section, but I remember if you were with me on Friday, I kept saying that too, and it wasn't. But it's really because of that global system of agriculture. And so when we take a look at this, understanding some trends, like you should be able to say, if I said up here, you know, in the Mediterranean region, you should say grapes and olives, Mrs. Brandt. Yes, I've got it, grains. Yes, over here I've got rice. And so you can find plenty of these types of maps. But what we're really trying to get at is how are they connected? And so here's a supply chain map. And so when we talk about that exchange, that's the degree. So the reality is, it shouldn't surprise you, you know, this canned tuna fish, that your fish is starting someplace over in Southeast Asia. Okay, if you know enough about those climates and understanding those foods, that should make sense. Does it surprise you that it may be pre-canned someplace else, then we're canned here, and then it's distributed to the United States? It's those linkages. And so when we talk about scale, understanding, have some idea of a couple different crops, where are some trends in the world, and then maybe the path on how it gets to the consumer. Here's another example, taking a look at the United States. What are some of those trends? Okay, so when I look at Wisconsin, you know, the milk coming from cows, but the reality is, you know, yes, that is kind of, they say that this is saying our most valuable, but I would argue, what about cheese and butter? Just because of consumers. We take a look at some of those other images that we talked already about through here, that beef, the cattle, should not surprise you about this aquaculture up in Alaska, the fishing industry, and fruits and vegetables in some of these warmer areas, and so how they contribute to those areas. And the reason I point this out, so this is the US, and if we really look at feeding the United States, if we just focused on feeding the United States, pretty balanced diet, don't you think? We have access to a lot of different things. But if I go out to a global scale, we know, take a look down here, that there is a food dependency, that there are countries that are dependent on receiving food. Okay, so those dark orange, they were on having enough food to feed their people. And some of you might go, what the heck with Japan? Japan is kind of interesting. They are kind of an outlier when we talk about these things. Japan's an outlier because it has kind of latched onto that technological, our business side. And so they just don't have enough land to really produce enough food for all of the people living there. And so, but they've found a way to balance their trade, unlike what we find throughout a lot of those other areas. That shouldn't surprise you that they're having to import so much of their food. And so that import dependency really on those grains and those staple products can create a problem. Even a bigger problem is when we start digging in and we look at these countries about luxury goods. Luxury goods, remember, are goods that we're not going to sustain life. And so we dig into, for example, let's kind of dig a little deeper here into some specifics. Here's where we find some palm oil. I don't know why it's written oil palm. That's weird. Sugar, coffee, tea, cotton, cocoa. Okay, and so those aren't things that are going to sustain life. And we know that a lot of these countries are struggling economically. Well, where are they located? Let's look at it from a different angle here, that bean belt. Let's just look at coffee for a second, right through the tropics. Brazil, one of the leading exporters, Vietnam, Colombia, but who's consuming it? Take a look at this. So here's another map, another layer. The consumers of it are not Brazil and Vietnam, okay? Look at Northern Europe, look at the US and Canada. When we take a look at, you know, the top coffee importers, I mean, look at Finland. So this is just another way of looking at that data. Have they created such an imbalanced trade relationship? And really what we're coming back to is understanding that scale and those relationships there. So I talked for a long time today, and I think that there were some really good questions that came out of this. And so really remember what we've been doing is we've been looking at different scales. And so I ask, you're going to look at least, you're going to, in one of your FRQs, you're going to have 2 stimulus materials, and one you're going to have 1. First thing, make sure you read the title, but then look at what scale, what information is being presented to you. So in that, I would love for you to practice this one. Okay, and this really is having you're going to identify in A and B, but then what you're going to do is explain that relationship between the area population. Density affects the size of districts. Describe one way in which the processes of redistricting can be manipulated for political gain, and then one challenge a representative might face in connecting with rural constituents. Just so you know, I actually assigned this one to my own students. It is on AP Classroom. There's a couple other questions, I believe, with it, but you can always go and practice and see the rubric there if you're dying to look at it, but I just wanted to let you know where I got that. So I do want to thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed the overwhelming amount of information, but takeaway is this. Take away the importance of looking at that scale and what story is trying to be told. You know, what's the claim that that image is showing you? What's the claim the map is showing you? And then what evidence do you have? You know so much. Go ahead and connect the dots for those readers. You've got this. Have a great night, everybody. We look forward to seeing the rest of the week.